join in and then you'll start the talk.
Sure. Anurag, you'll have to allow screen sharing. I hope that's
That's fine. That's
not
fine.
a problem. Yeah. So when you start, are you already recording?
Yes, sir. I just started the recording and it has been enabled.
Fair enough.
Something is off with my camera. Let me just debug it. But I'm here.
Good afternoon, Professor Amish.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah.
Should we start? Will we have people?
Yeah, I think Anurag, we can start.
Yeah, we can start with you. You can start the broadcasting now.
We have already broadcasted. 34 people have joined in, and we can start the session in next 2 minutes so that people can join in.
Okay.
I think we can start now.
Okay. Right. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IIMA Public Policy Alumni Special Interest Group webinar series. The alumni special interest groups at IIMA are platforms that bring together alumni, faculty, and students and leverage the collective intellectual resources engaged in specific areas such as healthcare, education, technology, analytics, public policy, etc., to bear on the most challenging issues of our times. Faculty and alumni are already making stellar contributions, but the ASIG platform allows them to collaborate with each other much more intimately and to engage with industry and practitioners in a much more multifaceted manner. Now, the public policy ASIG in particular is a group of alumni and faculty with expertise and interest in fields of public policy and development. It aims to foster collaboration among IIMA community, which is the faculty, students, and alumni, and the wider world of public policy practitioners to contribute to India's inclusive development agenda. Now, the webinar series aims to bring the thoughts, views, and expertise of renowned experts to the IIMA community. Now, since the pandemic started, the group has launched quick value adds for dealing with the crisis, including identifying model response structures and practices across sectors, districts, and countries. The members have also started compiling ideas and norms for the longer term new normal in their respective sectors. Nevertheless, uncertainty certainly abounds these days, and as if technology wasn't enough. I mean, technology was already changing things at a very rapid pace, and then comes along COVID. So policy is, really grappling to catch up. And along this this journey, we've had considerable interest from alumni in partnering with faculty to work on these upcoming issues, specifically on cases and publications and related areas, which leads us to today's topic, which is Alumni-Faculty Partnership for Case Study Development. We have with us Professor Vijaya, Faculty IIMA and Chairperson of the Ravi Matthai Center for Educational Innovation, to take us through some of the details that we can cover in this short span of time of today's webinar. To all the participants who've joined in, thank you, and please send in your questions in the Q&A section. I now invite and hand over the platform to Professor Sherichan to take it forward. Professor.
Thank you, Anurag. Okay. Now, first, let me thank you, Anurag, and the others here for giving me this opportunity to talk about an aspect of the Institute that started off as an import, but over the years has become very distinctively Wimbian. So I'm going to focus only on the case writing part, not so much on the method. And just in answer to a question that popped up just now, please contact the coordinators in case you have a case study with you. Okay. Now, let me begin with a brief tribute. Now, these are some people, I don't know how many of you have had the benefit of their classes. But true, it was Harvard, and you had some great people from Harvard, Harry Hansen, Warren Haynes, and many others who implanted this method in the Institute. But then you've had a whole series, dozens of faculty members since then, who have taken up this method, shaped it to our context, and have developed their own, ways of teaching through the case method. So you see Professor Mote, for instance, here, top left, and then Professor Srinivasa Rao, who played a very crucial role in setting up the case unit, Professor Bandari, Professor Balakrishnan, and then perhaps two people who I think have played a very significant role in systematizing the method. How do you go about writing cases? How do you teach through cases? Professors Dikshit and Abhinandan Jain, M.R. Dikshit and Professor Jain, both of them, outstanding contribution to the case dimension of this institute. And of course, Professor Mahasuk Vora, who's there, extreme left bottom. Now, all these people have, given us a legacy which today is carried forward by people like Professor Saral Mukherjee, Arvind Sahai, Sunil Sharma, Sunil Maheshwari, Chitra Singla, Amit Karna. I can name a number of people who are taking this legacy of the case method forward. And if there is one lesson that I have learned, working with these people, especially very closely with Professor Rao, Professor Jain, and Professor Dikshit, if there is one lesson that I have learned about case writing, it is this. It is this SOL. Okay, this is what makes a case very different from other types of teaching instruments that this institute uses. Now, what are these three terms? Let me quickly run you through these three terms. First is slicing. The S stands for slicing. That is nothing but, where does the case end? Where does the case stop? Where do you, as a case writer, stop in this decision-making cycle? I'll come to the details a little later. The O is actually a very key part of planning a case, which is the occurrence, an event that happens in real life which opens up the opportunity to teach students to learn to do. And the L is the learning objective. By putting the student in that occurrence, what do you want the student to learn, comprehend, and then apply in order to learn to do? What that doing is, I'll come to a little later. Now, let me take you through each of these three things in the next few minutes. Slicing. Now, this is a way that we have developed in this institute to look at organizations. So every organization is a bundle of decisions. And any event that you can show me today has a set of antecedents, something that has happened in the past. And obviously, that decision or event is going to lead to certain consequences. So any event is embedded in a chain of such events. And we prefer to look at it as an endless series of cycles, starting from the bottom. For example, if you decide to launch a new scheme, a new health scheme, let us say today, obviously there is an implementation going clockwise. That implementation would have a whole series of intended, unintended, planned, unplanned, foreseen, unforeseen, all kinds of consequences, which in turn raise new questions for you, which is what this institute calls diagnosis, problem diagnosis. And then, of course, the traditional WAC framework would have taught you from the problem, you go to options. From the options, you determine based on your objectives what your criteria are, apply those criteria to come up with a new recommendation, which in turn goes on and on. Now, if you notice, you have 6 theoretical slicing points here. Where do I stop the case? Saying that, yes, I have decided to launch such and such a health insurance scheme. Now you tell me how you would go about implementing it. That is one case which starts from the bottom left. So the slicing point, in other words, determines what kinds of skills you want the student to develop. So obviously I'll start at bottom left if I'm looking at planning implementation skills. How do you go about preparing contingency plans? But if I come to the bottom right, then that's just before a decision is taken. And this is the traditional case that all of you would have studied any number of cases which tend to get called decision-making cases. So I give you the options, figure out what the criteria are, and then based on your application of the criteria, take a decision. So that is the doing that you would expect. So the simple point here is a slicing point, which is a choice that you make as a case writer, determines and is determined by the kinds of skills you want students to develop. The O, the occurrence. Simply put, nothing but a real life event that allows you or forces you to re-examine your current situation, and 2, it calls for some action. It calls for some action. That is a real life event. Somebody has left this policy scheme that is in operation, or somebody announces this is going to happen. There is a breakdown in the chain of supply. Okay, somebody has died as a result of the vaccine that you gave. All these are real life events that force you to examine the situation and demand some action. Okay, there are any number of examples that one can look at. In brief, a real life trigger, an external trigger or internal to the organization that forces you to take another look at your situation and do something. The third, very important. Now, this is again in your control. Occurrence is something not in your control. Occurrences happen. But putting that slicing point and the learning objectives together is what defines the academic component of a case. Very simply, by putting the student in that situation, by asking her or him to do something, take a decision, make an implementation plan, do some diagnosis, develop criteria, evaluate your options. What specific knowledge, skills, and attitudes are you asking the student to first understand, comprehend, and then apply to the occurrence so that the response comes up? Now, these three are extremely important. In fact, this is what this institute has sort of evolved over the years. SOL, SOL. The slicing, the occurrence, and the learning objectives. Put these three things together, get a good match, and you have a wonderful case with you. So, putting these three things together, let me define for you how the Institute defines a case. A case, nothing but a classroom instrument, but there are certain conditions attached to it. First, real life. Okay, the case unit in this institute does not accept fictional situations. Real events, organizations, or people consistent with the principle, the original principle of the case method, which was bring the field to the class, and is constructed around these three things that I mentioned. An appropriate slicing of the cycle, a very clear occurrence as a trigger, and an understanding of what you want the students to learn and apply in order to do something. So therefore, the key crux of the case method and a good case would be, to what extent does it help the student learn to do? And doing, as we saw, can be any stage of that decision-making cycle. Next point, there are two ways of looking at this real life events, organizations, and people. One is through primary data. That is, as someone mentioned in the beginning, okay, I have a case with me. What do I do with that? So that is primary data-based cases. That is fieldwork-based cases, interviews, documents, archival resources, your observations, and so on. Remember that in such cases, the organization has to clear the case for use in the classroom. So there is a particular permission, a form that we have. We call it Form 2, which is nothing but the organizational clearance that the case writer obtains from whoever is authorized in the organization to release this. This is mandatory, no compromise on this. Real life, one can also process it through secondary data. These are less valuable. Okay, they are real indeed, real life, but then the data on which you construct your case is publicly available, accessible, published data. Okay, so therefore, in this case, organizational permission is not needed. Nowadays, you find cases in multimedia form, video, text combinations, or real life interviews combined with text, or even graphic comic book format. We have one case in our center just published, which is entirely reads like a comic book. So there are other formats, but the traditional format is something all of us are very familiar with, which is the text form. Teaching manuals, manuals that help the user of the case are mandatory. So a case goes along with a teaching note. So in brief, something that is constructed around SOL based on real life. That is fundamental. And a teaching note that accompanies the case. Now I'm just going to give you a minute to read through this example, which Anish is certainly familiar with. Now just take a few seconds to quickly go through this. So this is an example of the initial intent note that we had prepared, along with Dr. TV and a couple of others from the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. Now, what is missing in this account is the learning objectives. Now, that is something that your faculty partner would be best placed to advise you on. But you look at the other two parts. Here's a very clear occurrence. The occurrence is very simply the trigger, which is this meeting that has been called by the Secretary of Urban Development. Okay, fair enough. So a very clear occurrence. The background, very clear. The decision cycle, you should be able to figure out where this is stopping, where you would stop the case. That is given actually in the last sentence. Now, what should Dr. TV do to prepare for this meeting, which has been called by the secretary? Situation is very clear, very rich potential here. You have Delhi Metro as the consultant saying, yes, a neutral camber can be allowed. Here is CRML, internal people saying, no, a positive camber is a must. A bidder who's been kicked out goes and complains, and then the whole thing has blown up into a meeting. Now, this is an example of the kind of outline that you would prepare upfront. What needs to be added to this are the learning objectives. Now, this gives both of you, the faculty partner as well as the alumnus partner, a good note which can be cross-checked with a couple of others. Does this make sense? So this, along with your learning objectives, would make it very clear. Let me show you one more example. One more example from Uttar Pradesh. Great example once again. Just take a few seconds to quickly go through this. Once again, a very clear brief which will allow you to get some feedback on the idea that you have. You have November 2014, the nutrition mission set up by the government. Within a couple of months, second week of January, here is the director, who has come up with a draft. Now, unfortunately, the draft, now it's been pointed out to him that your draft is highly inaccurate. The data that you're using is all, questionable. You've drawn on your own department's MIS plus the Department of Health. Now that's being challenged. And suddenly, Dr. KA has realized that, your MIS needs a lot of revamping. And obviously, your staff are not generating quality data and are not reporting correctly. That seems to be there. But then the real trigger is, the draft has to be finalized and put out. How do I respond to the criticisms and take whatever steps are needed to come up with a draft which can be put up before the public and is not going to get criticized? So what should Dr. KA do in this? Very clear trigger. The draft, the criticisms of the draft has triggered a re-examination of the last 2.5 months of work that Dr. KA and others have put in. Fortunately, you're still at the draft stage. Before you finalize, what do you do? What do you do? There are some long-term issues. Yes, the MIS needs revamping, but the third consideration is to respond to these criticisms and finalize the draft. So by now you would have got an idea of how these two things come together, the slicing point and the occurrence. What is missing in both these examples are, the learning objectives that you would add to these 2 points so that you get SOL. So by putting the student in Dr. KA's position or Dr. TV's position, what do I want the student to first comprehend, analyze, and then apply, and then come up with a plan saying, this is what I'm going to do in this meeting with the Secretary, Urban Development. This is what I'm going to do before I put out this draft for the public. That doing part comes from the learning objectives that you think best match the occurrence and the slicing point that you have. I'm not going to go into the other examples. There are a number of other examples equally good. Now, the point here is, by doing this SOL and choosing the right slicing point, you target different skills. Okay, that is what the case method taken as a whole tries to do. So one case may focus on the consequences of earlier decisions, in which case you want the student to become a better diagnostician, evaluate your past decisions and tell me what is wrong. Ask new questions. That skill is something I want. This is what generally gets called a diagnostic case. Then you have the typical problem-solving case where situation is given, you analyze the situation, derive the problem, structure the problem, apply whatever you learned in terms of decision-making frameworks, generate options, criteria, and do a recommendation. Decision-making cases all of us are familiar with. And finally, if you want skills in developing action plans, anticipating consequences, then you would write what is called an implementation case. I have taken this decision. Now you tell me, how do I go about putting it in practice? And tell me what kinds of contingency plans do I need to make? So this is how you bring together the slicing point, the occurrence, and the learning objectives that you have. Okay. At this stage, my advice is, do not worry about the architecture, the guidelines for writing. Very simply put, the IIMA Case Center has well-established guidelines which will be made available to you. What are the do's and don'ts of case writing? All this is secondary. What is fundamental is solve. If you are clear about the slicing that you would like to do, the occurrence that you would like to build upon, and most important, the learning objectives that somehow go along with the slicing and the occurrence. After that, you can go through these guidelines. There's no issue. But getting these three elements into a working partnership is fundamental. Okay. The first point, one of the emails that I think Vidhi had, or Sohail, one of them had sent me, also mentioned that, there are some areas of concern, some conflict of interest. What do you do? Let me answer that question in about 5 minutes. The fundamental question that you need to ask yourself and answer is, who are you as a case writer? Never, this is, in fact, I would rate this the most important lesson I have learned in this institute in the last 30 years. Who are you as a case writer? A representative of the learner. As long as we keep this upfront, I am just a very simply put, a representative of a learner, somebody who's going to come to this institute, some other management institute tomorrow. Okay, as a representative of the learner, I have certain obligations, certain responsibilities that I can't shirk. Okay, if I'm a representative of the learner, what am I not? What am I not? Now, these are the 6 major things which tend to get confused with case writing. Now, remember, all of these 6 different roles have a value, but somewhere else. I'll come to that a little later. Now, who are you not? First, a journalist, certainly not. You're not an essay writer. You're not a researcher. You're not a storyteller. You're not a consultant. And the most important, this is where most initial attempts at case writing go wrong, including my own experience. You tend to evaluate when you write. You start thinking about why did I or why did this person do this? Could have done this better. And therefore, that last bullet is extremely important. The language in which a case gets written is completely non-evaluative. No adjectives that you slip in. That is very important. And a good case reviewer, all of us get to review cases fairly frequently. And a good case reviewer takes this criterion extremely seriously. If there is evaluative language used in the case, certainly there is a negative feedback to the writer. But if you're not these, what are the other outlets for you? Please, a case, learning to do is the focus. Other accounts, other learning tools are certainly possible. As a journalist, I would create an engaging account which students might find interesting. Go ahead, by all means. A good article, an analytical article, maybe a journal is a better outlet. Not a case may not be the best format if that is the kind of contribution I want to make to learning. Okay, storytelling, once again, possible. Client-oriented outlets, including our own institute, might benefit from a consultant's report. Evaluator, possibly a journal. So the simple point here is there are other formats apart from the case that you can also consider. So there you would take a different role. But if you want to be a case writer, you want to take up the format of a case, then learning to do, that learning objective, occurrence, and slicing, that takes center stage. The other roles can go to different outlets, but if you're interested in a case, remember, you are a representative of the learner, and therefore the way you write should help that learner comprehend certain skills, certain pieces of knowledge, and more important, Vidya Vinyogat Vikasa, apply that knowledge to a clear occurrence so that I demonstrate that I have learned to do A, B, C, D, E. That is extremely important. Finally, a few pieces of advice. These are the obligations that I mentioned. If you are a representative of learners, present as well as future, you are creating opportunities without distorting management phenomena. So the first obligation is don't distort, don't distort. And this is an advice which I received from Professor Mukund Dikshit. I've never forgotten this. We use it for the last 20 years. We've been doing it in our case workshops, that you are just an intelligent video camera. If you keep this as the second guideline, a representative of a student, second, I am nothing but an intelligent video camera. Okay, therefore, why am I intelligent? Because I'm certainly, ignoring certain things. I'm certainly focusing on certain aspects of the occurrence and the situation. I'm intelligent. But a video camera which doesn't have any fancy editing facilities which can distort management phenomena. That is, I think, a very good piece of advice to keep in mind when you go out for data collection and when you write the case, that I am nothing but a fairly intelligent video camera. Now, this might be controversial for some of you who want to write cases on your own. Avoid writing cases in which you are the protagonist. The reason is very simple. Our IIMA's case partners reject such cases where the writer is also an interested party. Conflict of interest, many things come up. A very good advice that we give to people in such situations is pair up, form a team, work in pairs, and exchange projects. So you write on my case, I write on yours. That takes care of the conflict of interest, because this will be a major issue when you actually register the case. Okay. IIMA Case Center also takes these things very seriously, and we don't push cases in which the writer is also part of the situation, the protagonist. Okay. A very simple way out is form pairs, so that one faculty alumnus partners with another faculty alumnus pair, and then you exchange and then work on each other's cases. That would be my sincere advice, because later on we don't want problems at the time of registration, at the time of classroom use. This can become a problem. Third is, remember, always as a matter of good practice, clearances at two stages. One is before you actually start. Whoever is the stakeholder, whoever has the authority, get permission to write the case. After it is written, when the draft is shared with that person, get permission to use it in the classroom. So if you want our IIMA Case Center, Anish and Professor Basant, Professor Sugadan, any one of Anurag can arrange for this. There are well-defined forms for these clearances. So Form 2, as I mentioned earlier, is the clearance for classroom use. Without that, we don't use cases in the classroom, unless it's only a trial of a case which is yet to be registered. So there is a certain ethical obligation on us to get the permission of the organization or the person who has the authority to give that. This is an ethical compulsion that is placed on the case writers. Communicate the purpose of the case to the case provider. Now, this is very important, because in our experience, we often find that the motives of the case provider, that is the protagonist, may not necessarily match the case writer's motives. The provider might expect some kind of an evaluative write-up, something which tells you that I've done a great job. So that is why it's extremely important upfront to clarify the purpose of the case as just a tool to promote classroom learning. That's it. A protagonist who understands that is not going to create problems while you're writing the case. Okay. Now, if you are writing the case, you would know what a case entails and what are the obligations placed on the writer. But let's say an independent provider who has no exposure to the case method. Now, that person might have motives which might conflict with the neutrality, with the non-evaluative requirement for a case study. The second major concern was, how do I go about establishing this alumnus-faculty partnership? First, very important, share your commitments. This is where things break down. People are extremely busy. You will be busy. The faculty members will have 100 other constraints. And this is where the earlier example that I mentioned has still not taken off, because this managing time and conveniences of each other becomes extremely problematic. You, as the practitioner, would be best placed to talk about the occurrence. Okay. But please work with your faculty partner on clarifying this question. Why the hell do you want to put the student in this situation and make her do this? Get clarity on that. This requires a lot of setup time, discussion time upfront. Don't cut this short, because then the case will certainly go wrong. This is a very important upfront commitment that the two of you agree upon. And following from this, agree on the teaching agenda. What exactly is the occurrence and the learning objectives that go with that occurrence? Do not start your interviews before you have this agreement on the teaching agenda. This, again, is part of the setup, very important. Later on, you will end up with conflicts between the team members if there is no agreement on this. Be aware of the strengths. Okay, faculty members possibly would have greater access to the literature and therefore might tell you that, okay, now I have to attend this meeting called by the Secretary Urban Development, where the Delhi Metro Rail Chairman, my MD, is going to be there. He's going to support the bidder. Now, what is the theory that I need to read up before I start answering this question of what Dr. TV should do in preparation for that meeting? Is it negotiation? Is it, balancing two different technical viewpoints? There could be many other learning objectives in that one occurrence of the meeting called by the Secretary Urban Development. So the strengths of each partner followed up by a sharing of the protocol. A protocol is very important. Okay, how do you want to go about doing the field work? That is interviewing, writing up, drafting, reviewing. And one piece of advice that we give is one member becomes an auditor. This is very important because the case writing guidelines, at least the mechanical guidelines, are taken very seriously by a reviewer. So one of you, either the faculty member or the alumnus partner, needs to become an auditor with the authority to enforce these guidelines. So if there is an evaluative statement, for example, Dr. TV prepared a very comprehensive plan. Now the word comprehensive, very comprehensive, is misplaced. So the auditor would strike that out. Dr. TV prepared a plan. Let the student work out whether it's comprehensive or not. Now I'm just giving an example. So such evaluative words will be taken out by the auditor because these tend to slip into the draft that we prepare. Whether you like it or not, this is going to happen. Therefore, one of you becoming an auditor is extremely important. Okay. There will be disagreements. Okay, don't worry about those. In a good academic partnership, one should expect disagreements. Only advice is don't let power differentials come in the way. Okay, faculty as more powerful or you as more experienced relative to a very new faculty member. These dynamics, I'm sure all of us are aware of these things. It's very easy to keep them at bay by keeping communication channels open at all times. That's very important. Stick to deadlines. This is the biggest problem. As soon as you make deadlines flexible, the enthusiasm and excitement can just disappear very fast. So as your protocol has certain deadlines, do not delay, do not compromise on these deadlines, because once enthusiasm is lost, you will never get it back. It's very difficult to complete that case. And when you write cases, there will always be something interesting that comes up during the field work and might appear much more important. Okay? Don't get diverted by that. Retain your focus, the focus as determined in the combination of S, O, and L, that needs to be maintained. Maybe you can start on a new case after you finish the current case. With that, let me close, and I hope I've taken my 30 minutes and I've not surrendered any extra time. I wish you all the best, and now I think Vidhi had mentioned that there might be some questions, which is the more interesting part. Let me stop sharing. And if there are any questions, please go ahead. I'm here to answer those. Yeah, over to you, Sohail and Vidhi and Akhilesh.
So, Professor, let me read out a question that has...
Please read out, because I'm not able to see that.
Let me read out a question that has been sent by Mr. Rakesh Bora. So he says, we live in an increasingly globalized world. The examples shown were or happen to be very India specific. How do you see the scope of international situations as contributing to the case writing?
Matters not at all. Matters not at all. I could have given you a global situation, but giving keeping in mind the public policy focus of this, I happen to pick up three examples from public policy work that we have done. I could have easily taken up a very different context. That is not the issue. The issue is, what is your occurrence? What is your occurrence? Can you find the appropriate learning objectives for that occurrence? And where would you slice the case? That's it. Whether it's the global context, Indian context, most of my work in case writing has been in education. Just completed a set of 70 odd cases for teachers. These are all village-based cases. The context is the village, all these 75 cases. Context is the village. So don't worry so much about the context. Get your occurrence clear, match it to the learning objectives, and decide on a good slicing point. That is more important. Context is part of the situation. Yeah, Anurag, you'll have to.
Yeah, so there's the other question is from Dr. Preeti Ranjan Sahu. What is the difference between case study based research and case study based teaching?
Teaching, okay, well, let's not get into that. Preeti Ranjan, my good friend, this question, we should take it offline, okay, because here we are focusing on faculty alumni partnering for teaching cases. Very briefly, the case studies that one writes can have multiple purposes, okay? So here we are focusing on one purpose, which is the teaching case. Now a case study, if it is written more like a research article or a paper, then you would combine 3 or 4 of them to generate hypothesis. That is the time when you would take a case into the research direction. Let's not get into that for the moment. There were a number of other questions which keep flashing on and off.
Yeah, so Priya Narayanan asks, do you see any merit in writing caselets? Students are sometimes not inclined to read long cases, or do you think the caselets don't serve the purpose?
Yeah, see, the length of the case doesn't really matter, okay? I can show you some very good cases which are about a page and a half, okay? Now, whether you call them a caselet or a full case is a completely, I would say it is not the right question to ask. What is important to ask is, regardless of the length of the case, does it have all 3 elements? That is more important. If it has all 3, 1 page or 10 pages does not matter at all. Okay, caselet may be a descriptive term for short cases. That is not the way to look at it. See whether it has all 3 elements clear, that you are clear about what the slicing point is, you are clear about the learning objectives that you have in mind, and you are clear about the occurrence that you want the student to respond to. If all 3 elements are there, the length of the case does not really matter.
Purnima asks that are we required to test the case before its submission?
Yeah,
if so, can we revise it based on the feedback in the class?
Yeah, I did refer to this. That is the only time when you would use a case without the clearance of the organization, when you are testing it in a class. Okay, so you would certainly test. There are a number of other specific guidelines that I have not touched upon. One of them would be a compulsory testing of the case draft that you have done with a class. Whether you do it online or offline is immaterial, but a testing is compulsory. What you do in the testing is you have an observer. Okay, since you will be doing the case teaching, you have an observer who takes down notes. We have very clear observation guidelines in the case center, and the observer gives you feedback on the trial, and then you revise the case. So that's not a problem. So you're getting into the later stages. I repeat, focusing on the initial setup is what leads to a successful case at the end. These other practical things like a testing, okay, and these things can be addressed very easily. That is not the issue. Yeah, Anurag, there were a number of other questions.
Yeah, Swagat Bose asks, when working on creating a case being written on public policy focus, where it is more broad spectrum at a national context with no specific occurrence, the outcome of the policy is pre-known based on further studies on the policy framework published publicly.
Yeah.
How do we specify the learning objective which will remain unbiased or pre-known?
Yeah. See, in that case, what you're saying is you're not writing a case, but you're writing something that can still be used in the classroom. This is what I distinguished earlier, the case to be distinguished from other forms that can be used in the class. So fair enough, if you don't have a clear occurrence, you're just putting together a good summary of how a policy was implemented, which has knowledge as an objective. The student certainly gains knowledge by reading that account. By all means, go ahead. Go ahead. Only thing is, you wouldn't call it a case. You wouldn't call it a case. You would call it something else. It could be an article. Okay, it could be some kind of a report written for a magazine or a semi-academic outlet, or even our own case center, which takes non-case products as well. So you can have various kinds of products, okay? But please keep in mind the distinction between a case, as we have defined it over a period of 60 years, and non-case learning instruments. Okay, something based on secondary data, published data without an occurrence, but which sort of brings in your analysis, has a lot of value in developing awareness, developing knowledge about that particular policy. By all means, go ahead, write that up. But then that need not be labeled a case. It can be labeled something. For example, in our own case center, we have another category called technical note. So case is only one of 9 products that we have. There are other products which go by the code TEC, which stands for technical note. Now, the example that you gave would fit into TEC. We also have another category called EX, which is an exercise, which is nothing but a fictional problem created based maybe on your own experience, whatever it is, but you create an experience. Only thing is, we won't call it a case. We would call it an exercise. Now that in terms of learning has value, no doubt about it, but then don't call it a case. That's it. So you have other options, other academic outputs that would be acceptable from the learning point of view. Okay. For example, a technical note would aim simply at creating more awareness or a better understanding and knowledge about the way, let us say, this issue was handled or this policy was designed and implemented. Okay, this is how Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana worked out in practice. That also has a lot of value. Okay, but then you won't have a specific occurrence and you won't have the task of asking the student to comprehend and then apply in order to do something that may be missing.
So there are a few questions on who people can connect to take this forward.
The coordinators.
Yeah.
That I'm not going to get into now.
Right. So that was not the question. I think one of the comments is that most of the case studies we propose pertain to our area of work in which we have expertise. So it is difficult to find material for cases as outsiders. This is by Harpreet Pratik.
Yeah. So this is where I said partner. When I said, why don't you partner, there were 2 reasons. One reason I explained to you in great detail that case clearing houses, repositories of cases, do not accept cases where the case actor and the writer happen to be the same person. Second reason for partnering is if you find a reasonably close, approximation with another alumnus, maybe a related area where that much of depth knowledge is not needed. So that is why I suggested, why don't you exchange roles? Okay. For example, in public policy, I have done cases. I'm equally comfortable with education, health, and social policy in general. Okay, but transport and logistics is something I would not get into. Okay, but anything related to social policy, with a little bit of extra reading and talking to people, I would be in a position to understand what the case provider is telling me, what kinds of questions I ask. Plus, you have the faculty partner. The faculty partner is not going to really be an expert in all areas. Faculty have written cases on a whole range of areas without claiming expertise in all of them. They would have a general understanding. So the role of expertise in case writing should not be overstressed. Okay, it is with suitable partnerships, it should be possible to have a minimum level of understanding of the technicalities. Okay, for writing the case. That's not really an issue.
One of the questions is there an honorarium or royalty that is associated with writing cases?
Yes, our case center has in place a system where there is a payback to the authors depending on the use, the levels of use, the utilization of the case. Depending on that, there is a certain small token honorarium that goes back to the authors. But then, the utilization of cases is so uneven. That is, there are a few cases which have become popular and they tend to get used. So the authors of those cases tend to get paid something. Okay, whether you're an alumnus writer or a faculty writer, that doesn't matter. But I suspect for most case writers, the royalty is not really the motive. The contribution to learning is one. Second is you get registered in a case center like IIM Ahmedabad's, then you reach out to a number of other universities abroad through the Harvard Business School, through Richard Ivey, through other European Case Clearing House. We have a number of other partnerships, okay? But there is a royalty that is dependent on the use of the case by buyers. That is the point, okay? So till that point of time, there is no payment. Whether you write a case, register, don't even talk of payment. But once it is registered, it gets marketed and people start buying the case, then there is a payment, then there is a royalty. But that is going to take years. It generally takes a very long time.
Does IIMA provide help in writing or typing the case by providing a typist or content writer to the alumni whose case study has been approved by a professor?
You see, there is what are the kinds of support that the case center provides? One is editorial support. Okay, writing support certainly will be difficult because it's better that the case writers write the case, including typing, dealing with the data, processing the data. There is a lot that a writer learns while processing the data. So my advice to you would be at least the writing, let it be handled by the authors, the faculty and the alumnus partner. That is clear. The editing, certainly the case center sends it out for editing, but after an intermediate stage is completed, which is the review. So the case draft that is submitted by an author first gets reviewed. And based on the review, if it goes ahead, then certainly editorial support is handled entirely by the case center. That is there. But for case writing, we do have a case writing associate, but that person is kept for, very, specific kinds of work. But as a matter of practice, a case writing support is not provided.
Ankita Singh asks, is there a guideline which specifies how many individuals can partner for a particular case?
No limit. Okay. The more partners you have, the more your group dynamics problems. With our faculty development program, we put a cap at 5. Okay, so informally, there is a norm that we follow informally, saying that let's have about 5 authors max. Beyond that, it becomes extremely difficult to get agreement. I have at least 1, 2, 3 cases at the moment which are stuck because the 5 members just can't agree on many things. Okay, so fewer the better, certainly. My understanding is that this webinar was organized for a faculty alumnus partnership. That is my understanding, that there would be a faculty partner, there would be an alumnus partner. So I'm going on the assumption that you would have at least 2 members in the group. So try to keep the number as small as possible, just in the interest of coming out with a case on time and completing the exercise.
There are a couple of questions on the kinds of things that cases can be written on. So one of them is on whether it can be written on technology-based matters, and another one is on whether tourism and hospitality would be a right industry to write about because it's been one of the worst hit because of the pandemic.
Yeah. So the industry or the sector does not drive case writing. That is fundamental. Okay. What drives case writing is an occurrence, something that happens in real life. Now, it may so happen that these occurrences are in the tourism and hospitality industry. If I want to write about how the industry has responded to the COVID pandemic, I would rather write a technical note, something which describes, based on secondary data, how badly or how well this particular industry has responded, and put that out. That's a very good way of creating awareness about how a particular industry has responded. But if I have an occurrence, that is, this particular person did not get rid of all his employees, kept them going for 6 months using this particular way, because in the hospitality industry, that is very important to retain your resources, which are highly skilled, at least the front end people. And that becomes an occurrence to me. The action of this particular organization or this particular hotel or this particular manager who did this in a pandemic, if I come to hear about it, I would certainly be very interested in finding out more about why this person has done this. And then the pandemic and the industry become the context. It can be global, it can be local, that is not the point. That becomes the context. What drives the writing of a good case is a match, I repeat once again, between a real life occurrence, an event, a happening in real life, and its synergy with a set of learning objectives, and therefore an appropriate slicing point. If that is clear to me, I would certainly go ahead.
So, Professor, I think we've almost run out of time.
Out of time, yes. Yes. I just saw the last question. What are the other categories? Okay, that is certainly not the focus of this talk. But yes, we have other categories. As I mentioned, there are 9 total categories. 2 of them are called supplements. Okay, so one supplement is called an epilogue. That is, if I've written a case and then I want to follow that up, and therefore I go back and study what has happened after the case was written, then I write an epilogue to that case. So that gets registered under epilogue. The second would be a general supplement to anything that I have already written earlier for the case center. So you take these 2 out, the remaining are all classroom purposes, classroom teaching, which means that there is a teaching manual attached to everyone. Now, what are these? The case, as I mentioned, is the first. Second is the technical note. Third is the exercise. Then you have industry notes. That is a general note, like, for example, how did the hospitality industry respond to the pandemic? So that would come under some kind of an industry kind of a note. Then we have the teaching note. Then we have the audiovisual format. Then we have added a new category called graphic case. So there are these 7 different types of cases and allied teaching material, all of which are accepted by the case center, plus 2 supplements. So that is the kind of coverage that we have. Yeah, back to you, Anurag.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this, Professor. I think this was a really illuminating session for most of us. And it's really interesting to sort of be on the other side of the table in a sense, because we've always been on the receiving end of it, never really knowing what's been, what goes on behind creating a case study with, So it's been really illuminating, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of response as we can see from a few of the questions that we've been receiving. And thanks for taking the time out, and I'm sure we'll trouble you more on this and many other topics. And thanks again.
Yeah, I'll get back to my friend Preeti Ranjan Sahu, who is sitting in Orissa. I'll get back to him separately. Just I'm making an announcement, assuming that he's still there.
So thanks a lot, Professor.
Thank you very much, Anurag.
Sure.
So I can take your leave?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.